HOA fined me for riding my own horse across my own land, certain they controlled everything. They never expected the only road serving their neighborhood legally crossed my property. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. Some people mistake a property line for a suggestion instead of a promise. The first rays of sunlight had only begun spilling across the pasture when Thunder's steady hoofbeats echoed through the morning mist. Riding him at dawn had become my favorite ritual long before anyone imagined building an upscale subdivision beside our family ranch. The smell of damp earth mixed with fresh-cut hay while a cool breeze carried the quiet sounds of cattle waking beyond the old oak trees. Everything about the morning felt exactly as it always had. Peaceful. Familiar. Mine. Then I saw the white SUV racing across the gravel road toward the pasture gate. Dust rose behind it in thick clouds until it stopped hard enough to scatter loose stones across the entrance. Rebecca Collins climbed out wearing polished riding boots that had clearly never touched mud and a navy blazer with the Ridgeview Oaks Homeowners Association logo embroidered over the pocket. She carried a clipboard under one arm as though she were arriving to inspect a factory instead of interrupting someone riding a horse across private land. "Mr. Mercer," she called loudly before I even reached the fence. "You need to dismount immediately." Thunder slowed beneath me while I guided him toward the gate. "Morning to you too." Rebecca ignored the greeting. She removed several papers from her clipboard and held them toward me with practiced confidence. "You've been observed violating community regulations regarding livestock activity visible from neighboring residences." I looked around the pasture stretching nearly 100 acres in every direction. The fences surrounding us had stood there longer than either of us had been alive. My grandfather built most of them by hand decades before Ridgeview Oaks existed outside a developer's imagination. "I'm riding my horse," I said calmly. "On my own land. Your activities negatively affect neighborhood appearance." "From my pasture?" "Residents have complained." I glanced toward the subdivision sitting beyond the southern tree line. Perfect rows of expensive houses overlooked land my family had worked for generations. Their sidewalks, decorative ponds, and carefully trimmed entrance signs looked new compared to the weathered barns behind me. Rebecca extended the citation another inch. "This notice carries an immediate fine of $1,000. I accepted the paper without reading it immediately. The fresh ink still smelled warm from the printer. Across the top appeared the familiar HOA letterhead followed by bold words claiming unauthorized equestrian activity violated architectural harmony standards. Not a single sentence cited county law. Not one referred to my property deed. Everything relied upon HOA rules written by people who apparently believed fences existed only for decoration. Several homeowners stood near the subdivision entrance watching from a distance. Some lifted their phones to record. Others folded their arms, waiting to see whether I would argue. Rebecca seemed equally confident. She expected anger. She expected shouting. She expected me to hand back the citation and start a fight she could describe later during the next board meeting. Instead, I folded the notice neatly and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Is that all?" I asked. She looked almost disappointed. "You'll receive additional penalties if the violations continue." I gently turned Thunder toward the open pasture. "Then I suppose you'll be sending more paperwork." As we rode away, I heard her tell one of the homeowners that some people simply refuse to respect community standards. I smiled to myself without looking back. Rebecca believed she had just established authority over my ranch. What she had actually done was leave behind the first piece of evidence proving she had never bothered to learn where her authority stopped and where my property rights had always begun. People often assume a ranch begins with horses. Mine began with a handwritten deed folded inside an old cedar box long before I ever climbed into a saddle. My name is Ethan Mercer, and my family had lived on that stretch of rolling pasture for nearly 80 years. My grandfather bought the land after returning from military service, when the valley was little more than open fields, winding creeks, and scattered oak trees. There were no decorative entrance signs, no neighborhood committees, no homeowners association, only fences built by hand, weathered barns, and families who respected boundaries because everyone depended on them. The horse I rode every morning was named Thunder, a calm bay gelding with a white blaze running down his face. He had carried me across nearly every acre of the ranch through changing seasons, droughts, heavy rains, and countless quiet mornings before sunrise. Riding wasn't recreation to me. It was how I inspected fencing, checked livestock, and appreciated the land that generations before me had worked to preserve. Everything changed when Ridgeview Oaks expanded toward our southern boundary. The subdivision looked immaculate. Fresh pavement curved between rows of expensive homes with identical mailboxes, decorative stone walls, flowering trees, and perfectly trimmed lawns. Most of the new residents had no idea the ranch beside them had existed decades before the first construction crew ever arrived. They saw horses and assumed the countryside had simply become another scenic backdrop for their investment. Rebecca Collins saw something different. She saw control. Within months of becoming HOA president, she introduced new neighborhood campaigns promising to improve property values, standardize appearances, and create what she proudly called a more refined living environment. At first, none of it affected me. The HOA governed homes inside the subdivision, while my ranch remained entirely outside its recorded boundaries. Or at least, that was how the law worked. Rebecca preferred a different interpretation. After the first citation appeared, more letters followed with surprising speed. One objected to horseback riding visible from neighboring streets. Another claimed livestock fencing disrupted community aesthetics. A third suggested the barn's weathered exterior created an inconsistent visual experience for prospective homebuyers entering the neighborhood. Every notice arrived on expensive letterhead. Every one ended with another financial penalty. Not one referenced county regulations. One afternoon, Rebecca drove onto the shoulder beside my entrance gate just as I was repairing a split fence rail. She stepped out carrying another clipboard while carefully avoiding the muddy ground surrounding the gate. "You've ignored the previous violations. I've kept everyone. You haven't paid them. I don't owe them." She sighed as though speaking to someone refusing obvious common sense. Living next to a planned community requires cooperation. I rested the hammer against the fence post. "My deed requires ownership." She smiled politely. "The board believes your activities affect our residents. The board doesn't own my ranch." Her eyes drifted toward Thunder grazing peacefully beyond the pasture fence. Things change. I looked across the valley where the old wooden fence separated my land from the manicured subdivision lawns. Property lines usually don't. She handed me another envelope before returning to her SUV. As the vehicle disappeared down the entrance road, I unfolded the newest notice. This time the fine had doubled. Attached behind it was a warning stating continued violations could result in legal action by the HOA. I folded the papers and slipped them into the same leather folder, holding every previous citation. They weren't evidence that I had broken the rules. They were evidence that someone had begun believing neighborhood bylaws mattered more than recorded ownership. And from experience, I had learned something simple about people who stop respecting property lines. Eventually, they forget exactly where those lines protect them too. Power rarely announces itself with a dramatic speech. More often, it arrives inside another envelope, another warning, another confident signature from someone convinced they can keep moving your boundaries one piece of paper at a time. After the second citation, Rebecca Collins no longer treated my ranch as neighboring property. She spoke about it as though it had already become part of Ridgeview Oaks. The letters became increasingly specific. One demanded that horseback riding remain at least 500 feet from the subdivision fence, despite every trail lying entirely inside my recorded property lines. Another insisted I replace my weathered split-rail fencing with decorative vinyl panels to create a more harmonious visual transition for neighborhood residents. The next suggested relocating my horse barn because visitors entering the subdivision could see its roof beyond the tree line. Each request sounded more unreasonable than the last. Each carried another financial penalty. I filed every notice inside the same leather binder without writing a single response. Paper has a remarkable habit of telling the truth later. One Saturday afternoon, I noticed several unfamiliar vehicles parked near the southern fence separating my pasture from the subdivision. Rebecca stood beside two HOA board members while a private landscaping consultant studied aerial photographs spread across the hood of a pickup truck. I rode Thunder toward the fence, but remained on my side of the boundary. Rebecca noticed immediately. "Mr. Mercer," she called with practiced confidence. "We're evaluating possible improvements." "For your neighborhood? For the surrounding area?" She pointed toward my grazing pasture. "We believe removing portions of that fence would improve visibility and create a more welcoming entrance." I looked at the weathered cedar posts stretching across the hillside. "My grandfather set those posts by hand. They're outdated. They're private." She smiled politely. "Private property still affects public perception." "No," I answered calmly. "It affects your view." One of the consultants quietly rolled up the aerial drawings while avoiding eye contact. Even he appeared uncomfortable. As I turned Thunder back toward the barn, I noticed orange survey flags planted just outside the subdivision boundary. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. The longer I looked, the more they bothered me. Later that evening, I walked the entire southern fence line carrying nothing but a flashlight and the original ranch survey my father had framed years earlier. Every iron monument remained exactly where licensed surveyors had placed it decades ago. The boundary hadn't shifted an inch. Only Rebecca's interpretation had. The following Monday, my attorney, Daniel Whitaker, stopped by the ranch after reviewing copies of the HOA citations. He read every page carefully before setting the binder on my kitchen table. "They're making a dangerous assumption." "I know. Have you ever shown them the recorded access agreement?" "No." "Why not?" I looked through the window toward the gravel road disappearing beyond the front gate. "Because they've never asked the right question." Daniel nodded slowly. "The neighborhood entrance crosses my property." He looked up. "They know that." "I don't think they've ever checked." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The old grandfather clock in the hallway marked the silence with its steady ticking. Finally, Daniel opened another folder containing certified copies of property deeds, historical plats, title records, and an easement agreement recorded years before Ridgeview Oaks existed. He placed one document at the top of the stack. "This," he said quietly, tapping the faded page, "is the one they'll wish they had read before sending those fines." I folded the document closed without another word. Outside, Thunder grazed peacefully beneath the fading evening light while cars from the subdivision continued using the only paved entrance leading home. Most of those drivers believed the road belonged to their neighborhood. They had no idea it crossed land my family had owned for generations, or that the legal agreement allowing them to use it had conditions no one on the HOA board had ever bothered to read. The mistake Rebecca Collins made wasn't sending another fine. It was believing repeated paperwork could slowly replace a recorded property deed. The citations continued arriving with almost perfect timing, as though the HOA board had scheduled them weeks in advance. Every Friday afternoon, another envelope appeared inside my mailbox carrying Ridgeview Oaks letterhead, another growing balance, and another warning that legal action would follow if I refused to comply. By the end of the month, the total exceeded $6,000. According to Rebecca, I had violated regulations by riding Thunder too close to the subdivision fence, allowing horses to graze within sight of neighboring homes, and maintaining agricultural fencing that failed to match the architectural standards of a community my ranch had never joined. The accusations became almost creative. One notice claimed hoofprints near my own creek created an unpleasant visual impression for residents walking along a public trail. Another suggested replacing the wooden entrance gate because it lacked the upscale appearance expected by prospective buyers visiting Ridgeview Oaks. Each page looked professionally prepared. Each one ignored the same unavoidable fact. The HOA possessed no authority beyond its own recorded boundaries. I refused to answer emotionally. Instead, I organized every citation by date, photographed each envelope before opening it, and scanned every page into digital archives. Daniel Whitaker, my attorney, encouraged the approach. "Keep everything," he reminded me. "They're building their own timeline, and eventually, they'll have to explain it." One quiet Tuesday morning, Daniel arrived carrying several certified copies obtained from the county recorder's office. We spread them across the large oak dining table that had belonged to my grandparents. Original deeds, historical subdivision plats, boundary surveys, title records, maintenance agreements. Finally, he unfolded the oldest document in the collection. It described an access easement recorded decades before Ridgeview Oaks existed. The neighborhood's only paved entrance crossed approximately 400 feet of my family's property before connecting with the county highway. Most residents never realized it. The asphalt looked like a normal public road. Legally, it wasn't. The agreement allowing access required neighboring users to avoid interfering with the owner's lawful enjoyment of the surrounding property. Repeated harassment, unauthorized interference, or attempts to restrict legal agricultural activity could trigger review of the access arrangement under specific conditions. Daniel rested one finger on the faded paragraph. This clause matters. I've read it. I don't think Rebecca has. I smiled quietly. I don't think she knows it exists. That afternoon, I saddled Thunder and rode the eastern pasture while late summer sunlight stretched long shadows across the grass. Everything felt unchanged. Cattle grazed peacefully. The creek reflected the blue sky. Red-tailed hawks circled above distant oak trees. Across the fence, however, something new caught my attention. Rebecca stood with two contractors near the subdivision entrance discussing measurements along the paved access road. One of them carried a measuring wheel. Another held rolled engineering drawings. They occasionally pointed toward my entrance gate before writing notes. I stayed where I was, watching from nearly 200 yards away. They never noticed me. Later that evening, Leonard Hayes, the county surveyor who had retired only a few years earlier, stopped by after hearing rumors about the HOA's latest plans. I recognized those contractors, he said. What were they measuring? The entrance. They think it belongs to the subdivision. Leonard slowly shook his head. They're measuring the road. He glanced toward the weathered deed lying open on my dining table. When they should be measuring ownership. As darkness settled over the ranch, I closed the file containing the easement agreement and returned it to its protective folder. Rebecca believed every new fine pushed me closer to surrender. She never realized every citation pushed the HOA closer to violating the very agreement that allowed hundreds of families to reach their homes each day. Sometimes the strongest gate isn't built from steel. Sometimes it's hidden inside a document everyone forgot to read. The strongest legal advantage rarely begins inside a courtroom. More often, it begins with the decision to stop arguing and start collecting facts. That became my strategy the moment Rebecca Collins crossed the line between sending meaningless fines and trying to dictate how I used land her association had never owned. I never mailed angry replies. I never attended HOA meetings to debate people who had already decided they were right. Instead, every citation went into a chronological file. Every conversation was written down. Every photograph was dated. Every envelope remained unopened until I documented it. Daniel Whitaker often reminded me that memories become opinions, but records become evidence. So I built a record. One Wednesday morning, we drove to the county recorder's office together. The old brick building had served the county for generations, and inside its quiet archive room rested property documents older than anyone living in Ridgeview Oaks. A records clerk disappeared into the back storage area before returning with several bound volumes and certified copies of historical plats. One oversized survey immediately caught my attention. It showed my family's ranch exactly as it had appeared more than 40 years earlier. The subdivision wasn't there. Neither were the paved streets or decorative entrance signs. Only rolling pasture, fence lines, creek crossings, and one gravel access road leading toward the county highway. Daniel smiled. History has excellent handwriting. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing deeds, easement amendments, maintenance agreements, and title records. Every document confirmed the same thing. The paved entrance now used daily by hundreds of residents followed the exact alignment of the original ranch access road. Years earlier, my father had signed a limited access agreement allowing future neighboring developments to cross a portion of our land under clearly defined conditions. The permission had never transferred ownership. It simply allowed passage. That distinction would soon matter more than anyone inside the HOA realized. Back at the ranch, I began organizing every document into separate binders labeled by subject. Property deeds, certified surveys, county plats, recorded easements, historical photographs, tax records, maintenance logs. Everything was scanned twice and backed up digitally. Nothing remained in a single location. Late that afternoon, While replacing a broken hinge on the main pasture gate, I noticed Rebecca's SUV slowing near the entrance again. She never stepped onto my property this time. Instead, she remained inside the vehicle, studying the access road through the windshield before speaking briefly with another board member in the passenger seat. Both of them pointed toward the paved entrance. Neither looked toward the old boundary marker standing quietly beside the fence. That marker had survived storms, floods, droughts, and decades of changing ownership around it. It had outlasted every neighborhood committee. It would likely outlast this one too. That evening, Daniel called with another update. I spoke with the title company, and they confirmed every recorded document. No surprises? Only one. I waited. The HOA attorney never requested a title review before issuing those fines. I laughed quietly. So they never checked who owned the entrance. They assumed. After ending the call, I walked outside as the last light faded across the ranch. Thunder grazed peacefully beside the weathered fence while distant headlights moved steadily along the subdivision entrance road. Every one of those vehicles depended on an agreement my family had honored in good faith for years. Rebecca believed she held leverage because she controlled an HOA budget and a stack of violation notices. She couldn't see the leverage resting inside a faded legal document filed decades before she ever purchased her house. I wasn't preparing revenge. I was preparing clarity. Because when ownership is challenged, the loudest argument rarely wins. The oldest document usually does. And somewhere inside the county archives, waiting patiently beneath certified seals and fading ink, was the single page that would soon force the entire HOA board to reconsider everything they believed they controlled. The morning the gate closed looked almost identical to every other morning on the ranch. Dew still clung to the pasture grass. Thunder wandered peacefully near the creek, lazily swishing his tail at flies while the first sunlight settled across the weathered fence posts my grandfather had set decades earlier. Nothing about the landscape suggested that anything extraordinary was about to happen. Yet before the day ended, every resident of Ridgeview Oaks would discover that property rights are far more powerful than neighborhood assumptions. 3 days earlier, Daniel Whitaker had completed one final review of every recorded document. There isn't a shortcut around this, he told me. The easement. He nodded. The HOA hasn't simply issued improper fines. He slid the faded agreement across my desk. They've repeatedly interfered with your lawful use and enjoyment of the property serving the access road. I read the highlighted paragraph one more time. The language was clear. The access agreement granted neighboring residents permission to cross my land under specific conditions, but it did not surrender ownership. It also preserved legal remedies if continued interference substantially affected the property owner's rights. Daniel looked at me carefully. You've been patient. I wanted to be certain. You are. For several seconds we sat in silence. Finally, I signed a formal notice. Not a lawsuit. Not a threat. Simply written notice that, based on repeated interference and documented violations, controlled access to the easement would be temporarily restricted pending legal review and renegotiation. Every requirement had been satisfied. Every deadline had been observed. Every notice had been delivered properly. Early the following morning, a licensed contractor arrived carrying materials for a heavy steel ranch gate. Unlike the decorative entrances leading into Ridgeview Oaks, this gate served a practical purpose. It stood exactly where the recorded easement entered my family's property from the county highway. The contractor reviewed the survey monuments before setting the posts. Nothing was placed without verification. By mid-morning, the installation was complete. Beside the gate hung a clean white sign. Private property access subject to recorded easement review authorized entry only. There were no insults. No dramatic statements. Only the legal status of the road. It didn't take long. The first residents slowed their vehicles, confused by the unfamiliar gate standing where open pavement had always welcomed them. Several drivers stopped to read the notice before turning around to search unsuccessfully for another entrance that didn't exist. By noon, Rebecca Collins arrived. She stepped out of her SUV with the same clipboard she had carried onto my ranch weeks earlier. This gate comes down today. I remained beside the fence, resting one hand lightly on Thunder's neck. No, you can't block our neighborhood. I haven't. She pointed toward the entrance. People can't get through. They can once the recorded agreement is honored. Her confident expression faltered for the first time. What agreement? I looked quietly toward Daniel, who stood several yards away holding a certified copy of the easement. The one attached to the road your board never researched. Rebecca reached for the document. Daniel didn't hand it over. Instead, he invited her attorney to request an official copy through the proper legal channels. Within minutes, more vehicles gathered behind the entrance. Residents stepped outside asking questions Rebecca couldn't answer. Some demanded to know why the HOA had never mentioned the road crossed private property. Others wanted to understand why the entrance depended upon an agreement instead of ownership. Rebecca offered no explanation, because she didn't have one. As the afternoon sun settled across the valley, I watched thunder graze quietly beside the same pasture where this story had begun. Nothing about my ranch had changed. The fences stood where they always had. The gate occupied land my family had always owned. The only thing that had changed was that people were finally paying attention to the boundary they had driven across every day without ever wondering who had the legal right to leave it open. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives with a locked gate, an old deed, and a document everyone else forgot to read. The sound that changed everything wasn't an argument at the gate. It was silence. For the first time since Ridgeview Oaks had been built, the steady stream of morning traffic disappeared from the entrance road. Instead of cars rolling confidently across my family's land, drivers stopped, read the notice beside the new gate, and slowly backed away. Within an hour, the quiet ranch that had endured weeks of HOA letters had become the center of every conversation inside the subdivision. Rebecca Collins arrived before 9 o'clock. This time she wasn't smiling. She walked directly toward the gate with 2 HOA board members and a man wearing an expensive gray suit whom I assumed was their attorney. Daniel Whitaker stood beside me holding a leather portfolio. Nobody raised a voice. The attorney spoke first. "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to discuss reopening access." "I'm listening." "This restriction creates a hardship for neighborhood residents." "It wasn't my first choice." Rebecca crossed her arms. "You can't punish an entire community." I looked at the stack of HOA citations Daniel had placed neatly across the hood of my truck. "I didn't begin this." The attorney requested copies of the easement agreement. Daniel handed him a certified copy obtained directly from the county recorder. For several minutes, the attorney read without saying a word. His expression slowly changed. He turned another page, then another. Finally, he lowered the document. "When did the board review this?" Rebecca answered immediately. "We didn't need to." The attorney looked at her with visible disbelief. "You absolutely did." Nobody spoke. The breeze carried the scent of fresh hay across the pasture, while thunder grazed quietly behind the fence, completely unaware that years of assumptions were collapsing a few yards away. The attorney closed the folder. "This agreement doesn't transfer ownership." "I know," I replied. "It grants conditional access." "I know." He looked toward Rebecca. "You told the board this road belonged to the HOA?" She hesitated. "We've maintained it." "Maintenance isn't ownership." The sentence landed harder than any accusation. By early afternoon, county officials arrived after receiving formal requests from both parties to verify the recorded property boundaries. A licensed survey crew unloaded equipment and immediately located the original iron monuments marking the edge of my family's land. Every coordinate matched the certified plats stored in county records. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had been misplaced. The road crossed my property exactly as it always had. Residents gathered near the entrance, quietly watching the surveyor's work. Several asked questions that Rebecca struggled to answer. When did the HOA buy this land? It hadn't. Why weren't we told? Because no one had checked. One older homeowner approached me after reading the posted notice. "I've driven through here every day for 12 years. I know. I thought it belonged to the neighborhood. A lot of people did." He looked back toward Rebecca standing beside the attorney. "I don't think she did either." Late that afternoon, the attorney requested a private conversation with Daniel. The two of them stepped aside while reviewing additional county records. When they returned, the attorney's tone had completely changed. "My client would like to discuss withdrawing every outstanding citation." Daniel nodded politely. "That's a good place to begin." Rebecca stared at him. "We're just giving up?" "No," the attorney answered calmly. "We're acknowledging reality." As the meeting ended, county surveyors replaced bright marker flags beside each monument before packing away their instruments. They had done nothing dramatic. They hadn't created new boundaries. They had simply confirmed the old ones. Watching them leave reminded me of something my grandfather often said while repairing fences. The truth doesn't move just because people stop looking at it. He was right. For weeks, Rebecca had tried to convince everyone that HOA authority extended wherever she believed it should. One afternoon, with certified records, licensed surveyors, and a careful reading of an old easement, proved otherwise. The gate never forced anyone to recognize my property rights. It merely gave them a reason to finally read the documents that had protected those rights all along. Justice didn't arrive with a dramatic courtroom speech. It arrived through a series of quiet decisions made by people who finally chose to read the documents instead of trusting assumptions. Within 48 hours of the county survey, Ridgeview Oaks scheduled an emergency board meeting. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood that the HOA attorney had advised immediate negotiations before the situation became even more expensive. For the first time since Rebecca Collins had handed me that first citation beside the pasture fence, I wasn't the one receiving official notices. The HOA was. Daniel Whitaker forwarded copies of every communication before I read them. The tone had changed completely. Gone were the threats of escalating fines. Gone were the demands that I stop riding thunder across my own land. Instead, every letter requested a meeting, proposed mediation, or asked whether temporary access could be restored while both sides discussed a revised agreement. I answered every request the same way. After all outstanding citations are withdrawn in writing. Nothing more. Nothing less. 3 days later, the board gathered inside the Ridgeview Oaks clubhouse. This time I attended with Daniel, not because I expected another argument, but because every resident deserved to hear the same facts that had already appeared in the county records. The atmosphere felt completely different from Rebecca's earlier meetings. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke confidently about property values. Instead, homeowners quietly studied copies of the recorded easement placed on every chair before the meeting began. The HOA attorney stood first. He explained the property's legal history, the original ranch ownership, the recorded access agreement, and the county survey confirming every relevant boundary. Then he addressed the citations. After reviewing the governing documents and applicable property records, the board acknowledges that the association lacked authority to regulate activities occurring on Mr. Mercer's ranch outside the subdivision. The room became remarkably quiet. Several residents slowly turned toward Rebecca. She remained seated with both hands folded tightly in front of her. One homeowner finally raised his hand. So the horse was never the problem? No, the attorney replied. The HOA exceeded its jurisdiction. Another resident spoke next. We've been paying legal fees to enforce rules that never applied. Again, the answer was brief. Yes. The questions continued for nearly an hour. Why hadn't the board ordered an independent title review? Why were county records never examined? Why had thousands of dollars been spent enforcing restrictions beyond HOA authority? Rebecca attempted to defend her decisions by arguing she had acted in the community's best interest. One elderly resident answered before anyone else could. Good intentions don't replace ownership. No one disagreed. By the end of the meeting, every citation issued against me had been formally rescinded. The accumulated fines were declared void. The HOA also approved reimbursement for my documented legal expenses and accepted responsibility for the costs associated with correcting the enforcement actions. More importantly, the board voted unanimously to require certified boundary verification before pursuing any future enforcement involving neighboring property. Rebecca resigned as HOA president before the meeting adjourned. She left quietly through a side entrance without making another statement. Several residents approached me afterward. Some apologized for believing the notices. Others admitted they had never realized the entrance road crossed private land. I shook every hand. None of them had written the citations. Most had simply trusted the wrong person. A week later, Daniel and I signed a revised access agreement preserving the neighborhood's ability to use the entrance road while reaffirming my family's ownership and protecting the ranch from future interference. Nothing about the land had changed. The fences remained exactly where my grandfather had built them. Thunder still wandered the same pasture each morning. The only difference was that everyone finally understood the boundary they had spent years crossing without ever questioning who had the right to protect it. Sometimes justice isn't measured by who wins an argument. Sometimes it's measured by how many people learn to respect a line that had been there all along. The first morning after everything was settled felt strangely ordinary, and I realized that was exactly what justice was supposed to look like. There were no television cameras waiting outside my gate, no reporters asking questions, no dramatic speeches celebrating victory. The valley simply woke the way it always had. A thin layer of mist drifted across the pasture, birds called from the old oak trees, and the rising sun painted the wooden fences with soft golden light. Thunder stood patiently beside the barn, nudging my shoulder as though reminding me that life had never been about HOA meetings or legal documents. It had always been about this land. I saddled him just after sunrise. The leather creaked softly as I tightened the cinch, and the familiar scent of hay, worn saddle oil, and fresh grass filled the cool morning air. For the first time in months, there wasn't a single citation waiting inside my mailbox. No threatening letters. No violation notices. Only silence. We followed the same trail my grandfather had ridden decades earlier. The old split-rail fences stretched across the hills exactly where he had built them. The creek reflected the clear autumn sky, and a light breeze carried the sound of cattle grazing beyond the western pasture. Nothing about the ranch had changed. Only the people outside it had. As thunder carried me toward the southern boundary, I could see the entrance road leading into Ridgeview Oaks. The new access agreement had already been recorded. The gate now stood open during normal hours, exactly as the revised easement required. Residents drove through without hesitation, but something about the traffic looked different. People slowed down. Several waved. One family rolled down their truck window as they passed. A young boy sitting in the back seat pointed excitedly toward Thunder. His father smiled and tipped his hat. "Beautiful horse," he called. "Thank you," I answered. That brief exchange meant more than either of us probably realized. Months earlier, many of those same residents had only seen my ranch through HOA complaints and violation letters. Now they saw what had always been there, a working ranch that had existed long before their neighborhood and had never asked anything from them except respect. Later that afternoon, Daniel Whitaker stopped by carrying a small envelope. "It's finished," he said. Inside was the final recorded confirmation showing every withdrawn citation, the revised easement agreement, and the completed legal filings. "No more paperwork?" I asked. He smiled. "Only the kind worth keeping." We walked together toward the old cedar box where my grandfather had stored generations of property documents. I placed the newest records beside the original deed he had signed so many years before. The papers looked remarkably similar despite being separated by decades. One established ownership. The other protected it. Before leaving, Daniel paused near the porch and looked across the open pasture. "You never really fought the HOA." I looked toward Thunder grazing peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. "No, you fought for something. The difference matters." After he drove away, I climbed back into the saddle one last time before sunset. Thunder moved at an easy walk along the fence line while the sky turned shades of amber and crimson above the valley. The entrance road remained open behind me, not because anyone had forced me to surrender my rights, but because those rights had finally been acknowledged and respected. Rebecca Collins believed ownership could be rewritten through meetings, fines, and confident speeches. She discovered that deeds don't change because someone votes against them. As the last light settled across the hills, I looked back once more at the ranch my family had protected for generations. My grandfather used to say fences aren't built to keep good neighbors out. They're built to remind everyone exactly where respect begins. He was right, because real justice isn't about locking a gate forever. It's about making sure that when the gate opens again, everyone crossing it finally understands whose land they're standing on and why the law protected it all along.